the love and admiration, not just of the industry, but the fans, is unequaled. I know right now there are millions of fans.
Yeah.
I'm getting choked up myself. There are millions of fans who are just devastated and crying. What a giant.
What does a legend wish for when he knows the end is coming? Just weeks before he left this world, the unthinkable happened. The heartbeat of rock fell silent. Ozzy Osbourne, the immortal voice that shaped a generation, the godfather of heavy metal himself, was gone. At 76, he took his final breath. And with that breath, a whole era in music ended. Not with noise, but with a silence so loud it shook the soul. But Ozzy, he was never just a musician. He was a storm, a revolution in black leather, a rebel priest with a mic in one hand and the fire of 1,000 voices in the other. He turned chaos into kingdom and ruled it with fury and love. So when he passed, it wasn't quiet grief that followed. It was a tidal wave. Fans across continents broke down. Friends stood motionless. And for Sharon, for their family, it was like time itself stopped. Because this wasn't just death. This was the world losing its roar.
Say good morning.
Still, the Prince of Darkness didn't fade into nothing. He left the way only he could. Bold, loud, unforgettable. And in those last precious weeks, he whispered a wish. Not a simple one. Not easy. It was raw, heavy, unexpected. Even those closest to him never saw it coming. But it came from somewhere deep, the very soul that had always chased meaning through melody. There was still a fire in him, one more dream clinging to life, and only Sharon, his fiercest love, his protector through storms and silence, could make it real. Before we go any further, please, raise a hand, close your eyes, feel it. This is more than a story. This is a tribute, not just to a man, but to a force of nature who refused to go quietly. Let your heart speak. Let your memories come back. Because what follows is a farewell shaped by thunder and devotion. The house was quiet during those final days. Not the eerie quiet of endings, but a kind of stillness that wrapped around everything. Curtains stirred gently at the Osbourne countryside estate. But inside, the world moved slower, like even time was holding its breath. Sharon was always there, day after day, never far. Her hand never left his. And Ozzy, once the wildest force on stage, now whispered when he spoke. Not because he had nothing left to say, but because his body simply couldn't match the speed of his soul anymore. Parkinson's is cruel. It moves like a thief in the night. It doesn't strike all at once. It creeps in, piece by piece, robbing strength, stealing movement, breaking what was once unbreakable. In that moment, the world understood. Ozzy's death wasn't the end of a story. It was the final verse of a ballad that would echo through generations. The tremble in Sharon's voice became the tremble in millions of hearts. The world hadn't just lost a rock star. It had lost a symbol of survival, a symbol of fire, of fall and rebirth, of a man who let his demons dance with him, but never let them win. Memorial concerts were announced across the globe. Artists from every genre pledged to keep his flame alive. Metallica declared they would rename their upcoming tour the Crazy Train Legacy Tour. Bruce Dickinson of Iron Maiden began work on a tribute album featuring legends covering Ozzy's most iconic songs. Even the Vatican issued a rare public statement acknowledging his influence. Though unconventional in form, his passion touched the soul of humanity. Plans for Ozzy's funeral were still being finalized. A private ceremony for family and close friends, followed by a global live-stream tribute in Birmingham. Sharon asked fans not to grieve in silence, but to light candles wherever they were, and, in his honor, play his music loud. He would have wanted that. Not silence, volume, and somehow, he still wasn't gone. His voice played on in car stereos, in bedrooms, on radios, in memories. His image lived on. His legacy, like the riffs he once roared over, refused to fade. Ozzy Osbourne may have left this world, but he had become eternal. As the final notes of his life faded, one truth remained. Ozzy didn't leave in silence. He left in thunder. That concert at Villa Park, once thought to be just a farewell show, was something far greater. It was the realization of a final, fiercely personal dream. A dream whispered in pain. A dream Sharon refused to let die. She had done what no one else could. She had reunited his original brothers in Black Sabbath after decades apart. Tony Iommi, Geezer Butler, and Bill Ward. She had summoned giants, Metallica, Guns N' Roses, Judas Priest, Anthrax, all of whom had once walked through the doors Ozzy helped kick open. What was billed as Back to the Beginning was, in truth, a living requiem, a love letter in distortion and fire, carved out of defiance. Fans came from every continent, waving banners, clutching vinyls, wearing shirts that read, "Thank you, Ozzy." The live stream reached millions, but in that stadium, time stood still. And when Ozzy appeared, not walking, but seated on his throne of steel, something sacred happened. He opened with, "Mama, I'm coming home." His voice cracked, aged, but it held. Every note was a goodbye. Then came Crazy Train. The riffs hit like lightning, and as he sang, the crowd didn't just listen. They felt, they grieved, they celebrated. There was no speech, no grand monologue, just a nod, a smile, tears, and finally, fireworks. Not as a spectacle, but as a salute. A salute to the man who had turned his body into an altar, his voice into a prayer, and his life into a cathedral of noise and redemption. Sharon had given him what no cure ever could, the right to end as he had lived, in power, on stage, with music still burning in his bones. She didn't just fulfill a wish, she honored a legacy. She protected a flame, and she gave a man the peace of leaving this world not as a patient, but as an artist, as Ozzy. When the stage lights dimmed, he wasn't diminished. He had been transformed. Ozzy may no longer sing, but his voice echoes in stadiums, in headphones, in every kid who ever screamed his name into the dark. His final whisper became a roar. His dream became real. And so the man who lived wildly, who fell hard, who rose louder each time, bowed one last time. Not in shame, not in weakness, but with grace, with power, with fire in his soul. Because Ozzy's story was never just about music. It was about resilience, about passion that burned through disease, through time, through every crack in the human body. It was about a love, pure, hard-earned, and unwavering. If you're still watching, maybe somewhere out there, you face loss too. Maybe you've held a hand in the final hours. Maybe like Sharon, you've carried a promise through grief. Maybe like Ozzy, you've clung to one last dream. To you, we send strength. Yes, life hurts. Yes, death feels cruel and always too soon. But if there's any comfort, it's this. When love leads the goodbye, even farewells can be beautiful. So let's say it together, one last time. Thank you, Ozzy. May the next world be gentler. May your soul finally rest, free of pain, free of weight, and may your spirit scream louder than ever. Rest in power, Ozzy Osbourne. We will love you forever. This was the same man who once flew across stages, who electrified arenas with a single scream. Now, some days, he could barely lift a spoon. In a rare moment of brutal honesty, he once said, "The past 4 years have been sheer hell for me. My health has been in a terrible state." And yet, even in that hell, the spirit remained. His mind, like an old amplifier that never truly dies, still crackled with clarity and bite. His wit, as sharp as ever, his timing, still perfect. And those eyes, those unmistakable eyes still burned with the same mischievous fire that once ignited thousands in a single glance. "This body's broken," he said once, flashing a crooked smile, "but the brain's still partying." Every morning he asked for the same thing, not painkillers, not doctors, just tea and Sharon. They'd sit together in quiet moments that felt endless, sometimes lost in conversation, sometimes just lost in time. He drifted between memories, his childhood in Aston, the bitter cold, soot-covered streets, the hunger, the fights. He laughed remembering his first gig, terrified, underprepared, and completely electrified. He spoke with deep love about Tony Geezer and Bill, the brothers who helped him birth a genre. And then his voice would dip, it would falter, break a little, and he'd speak of his children, of Kelly's fierce spirit, of Jack's unwavering calm, of Amy's quiet strength, of the grandkids who lit his tired eyes. "Promise me," he whispered to Sharon one night, barely audible. "They'll remember the fire, not the flicker." Sharon bit her lip. She had stood beside this man through everything, through addiction, through relapses, through chaos, fame, collapse, resurrection. She had seen him destroy himself, and she had watched him rebuild, but nothing compared to this. He had never been so physically diminished, and yet never so alive in soul. The body was quitting, but the man inside was not. And then came the moment she would never forget. It was late June, 2025. The sun was setting over their quiet estate, sky painted in soft orange and pink. Ozzy stared out the window, his gaze unusually clear, like a fog had lifted just long enough for something sacred to pass through. He turned slowly to Sharon and whispered, "I don't want them to remember a man in a wheelchair. I don't want to be their sadness. I want to give them one last roar, where it all began." That wasn't just a wish, it was a vow, a plea. One last act of defiance from a man who had made rebellion into art. Sharon didn't cry, not yet. She just nodded. She had a mission now, to take that dying wish and make it immortal. The next morning, she began making calls, quiet ones, strategic ones. Because Ozzy couldn't stand, couldn't tour, but maybe, just maybe, for one night, in one place, she could help him set fire to the sky one more time. Could a broken body still command a stage? Could the Prince of Darkness rise again? Not as a memory, but as a living storm? She didn't know, but she would find out, because Ozzy's final dream was now hers to protect. For over 4 decades, Sharon Osbourne had been far more than just a wife. She was Ozzy's anchor through every storm, his fiercest protector when the world turned cruel, the quiet architect behind his rebirths. She knew every scar on his body, every silence between his words, every rhythm of his broken sleep. She had seen him through chaos, through flames, through corridors that smelled of bleach and despair, through nights of screaming, and mornings of fragile hope. Ozzy was thunder, Sharon was steel. But now, for the first time, their roles reversed. It was her chaos to bear, her fight to lead, and she took it on without fanfare, without complaint, because she knew this wasn't just a concert, it was a mission, a last promise, a gift only she could give. She told no one, not Jack, not Kelly, not Amy, not even the doctors at first. She held it close like a secret flame cupped in her palms, terrified it would vanish if spoken too loud. And when she finally did whisper it out loud, to specialists, to managers, to friends, the answer was always the same. It's impossible. They called it dangerous, reckless. Even Ozzy, in one of his darker nights, pleaded, "I'm done, Sharon. Don't make me a fool." But she didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She just held his hand tighter and said, "You're not done. Not until the music stops." Behind closed doors, she pushed harder than she ever had. She negotiated with promoters. She begged for medical clearance under strict supervision. She coordinated with producers and stage crews. Every yes was carved out of 10 refusals. Every inch of progress was a war. But Sharon didn't back down, not once. Because this wasn't about ego. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about one man's final right to end his journey on his own terms. It was about catharsis, for him, for her, and for the millions who had carried Ozzy's music in their hearts like gospel. She wasn't just honoring his wish. She was delivering his dying will, turning breath into music and sorrow into thunder. When Ozzy couldn't stand without pain, Sharon helped him rehearse in whispers. She sat beside him, mouthing lyrics, letting his voice find the cracks and tremble through them. When he said, "I can't do it. My hands shake too much," she wrapped her fingers around his and said, "Then let them shake, but let the world hear your goodbye." She became a soldier of love, a general of devotion. While the world slept, she stayed awake, calling doctors in LA, pleading with specialists, rewriting set lists to match his breath, not his past. And when those same doctors warned her, "This might kill him," she looked back without blinking. "He's already dying. What matters now is how he leaves." Because Sharon understood something sacred. This wasn't just about letting him sing. It was about letting him choose his end, about giving dignity to a man the world had labeled mad, letting him exit not as a patient, but as a legend, a performer, a storm. She reassembled his old crew, the ones who knew how he moved, how he breathed. She handpicked the stadium. She choreographed every detail with the precision of a grieving warrior. Every camera angle, every lighting cue, every firework timed to the beat of a heart that was fading, but still fighting. And she kept it all a secret, not for shock, but for sacredness. This wasn't spectacle, it was resurrection. Her final gift was not just a show, it was a ritual, a thunderous requiem carved out of fire and love. And when the plan was finally complete, when every impossible piece had somehow fallen into place, Sharon stood before him, her hands trembling, her voice steady. "It's happening," she said softly. "July 5th, Birmingham, your night, your roar, one last time." And in Ozzy's weary eyes, something flickered, a light that hadn't been there in days, a glint of who he'd been and who he still was. Through the exhaustion, through the pain, he smiled. Not wide, not loud, just enough. And in that moment, you could almost hear it, the echo of a final scream that had yet to be sung. A man ready to die, but only after giving the world his soul one last time. But to truly understand why that final performance mattered so deeply, you have to go back to where it all began. Because Ozzy's last wish wasn't just about music, it was about reclaiming a life that had once been broken, about rewriting its final verse with triumph instead of tragedy. John Michael Osbourne was born on December 3rd, 1948 in Aston, a tough working-class district of Birmingham. He grew up surrounded by soot, factory smoke, and poverty. At school, he struggled, bullied by classmates, dismissed by teachers. He didn't know why reading was so hard, why letters danced on the page. Years later, he would learn it was dyslexia, but as a child, it just felt like failure. At 17, he found himself behind bars for burglary. Sleeping on cold concrete, he believed he had no future. He had no direction, no hope, only the noise of a world that didn't seem to want him. But in that darkness, something stirred. Music. He didn't just hear it, he clung to it. It wasn't an escape, it was air. It was survival. Then came 1968, and with it, a spark. Together with Tony Iommi, Geezer Butler, and Bill Ward, he formed a band that didn't just play music, they changed it forever. They called themselves Black Sabbath. Their debut in 1970 didn't sound like anything else. It was heavy, ominous, primal. Critics hated it. But the lost, the angry, the unheard, they listened, and they found themselves. Ozzy's voice, wild, cracked, unapologetic, wasn't polished. It was powerful, and it became the anthem for kids who felt invisible. Sabbath wasn't just a band. It was a movement, a rebellion, and Ozzy was its prophet. Paranoid, War Pigs, Iron Man. These weren't just songs, they were rallying cries. But even as his fame rose, the demons inside him never stopped chasing. By 1979, the chaos had caught up. Ozzy was fired from Sabbath for substance abuse and erratic behavior. To most, that looked like the end. But Ozzy had a way of rewriting endings. In 1980, with Randy Rhoads and a new band, he released Blizzard of Oz. It wasn't just a comeback, it was a rebirth. Crazy Train became an anthem. Mr. Crowley was hauntingly brilliant. Diary of a Madman proved he wasn't just surviving, he was dominating. His voice, unlike any in rock, balanced menace and melody, anguish and awe. He toured relentlessly. He stumbled. He fell. He relapsed. And yet the music never left him. In 1991, No More Tears reminded the world how deep his artistry ran. And in 1992, Mama, I'm Coming Home became one of the most tender ballads ever sung in metal. A love letter to Sharon and to the idea of redemption. Awards followed, Grammys, Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductions, both with Sabbath and solo, a star in Hollywood, another in Birmingham, the city that once turned its back on him. But his impact didn't stop at music. In 2002, MTV's The Osbournes brought him into living rooms around the world. And fans saw a different side. Not the bat-biting legend, but a soft-spoken, forgetful father fumbling through daily life. A man trying to be present, trying to stay grounded. It was unfiltered, messy, often hilarious, and it made Ozzy more human than ever. Even as age caught up and health declined, he never stopped singing. Not after the surgeries, not after the tremors, not even after he revealed in 2020 that he had Parkinson's. The past 4 years have been sheer hell, he admitted. My health has been in a terrible state. But still, he didn't stop. In 2022, he released Patient Number 9. It charted, it roared, it mattered. Because Ozzy's legacy wasn't just built on platinum albums. It lived in every misfit who found salvation in his scream, in every outcast who saw themselves in his chaos, in every artist who borrowed his fire. His story wasn't about perfection, it was about surviving with soul and refusing always to be silenced. Ozzy's influence didn't end with the music charts or the walls of packed arenas. It seeped into pop culture, into the living rooms of families who had never touched a metal album, and into the hearts of people who had once judged him without ever knowing him. In 2002, he returned to the spotlight in the most unexpected way, not with a guitar, but with a remote control. The Osbournes, a reality show that featured Ozzy, Sharon, Jack, and Kelly, aired on MTV and instantly became a phenomenon. It was chaotic, it was raw, it was unforgettable. Gone was the mythic figure cloaked in darkness and stage fire. In his place stood a man pacing through his kitchen in slippers, confused by technology, muttering about misplaced glasses. The world watched him fumble with the TV, mumble through dinner, and try, often hilariously, to be a normal dad in a world that was anything but. It wasn't a scripted performance, it was vulnerability, and strangely, it made people love him more. Ozzy became a cultural icon, not just for rock fans, but for teenagers watching reality TV, for parents relating to his bewilderment, for anyone who had ever felt overwhelmed by life and kept going anyway. And through it all, despite the chaos, one thing remained. He never stopped singing. Not after the falls, not after the tremors, not after the surgeries, not even after the word Parkinson's was spoken aloud. In 2020, he gave the world one of his most brutally honest interviews, admitting just how much the disease had taken from him. The past 4 years have been sheer hell, he said. My health has been in a terrible state. But even then, even as his body betrayed him, Ozzy released Patient Number 9 in 2022, and the world listened. Because it wasn't just a record, it was a statement. He still had something to say. He still had a voice. Because Ozzy's legacy, it wasn't just about gold records or Hall of Fame plaques. It was about defiance, about fighting to be heard, even when your body whispers, enough. It was about surviving, loudly. That's why when Ozzy asked Sharon for one last performance, it wasn't just nostalgia. It was a sacred ritual, the final beat of a heart that had carried 5 decades of thunder. And when that night came, 40,000 people gathered under the glowing lights of Villa Park. It wasn't just a concert, it was a pilgrimage, a farewell to a man who had turned pain into power, who made madness sing, who stood defiant even as the end approached. As the world unknowingly inched closer to Ozzy's final curtain, one city stood at the heart of it all. Not Los Angeles, not New York, but Birmingham, the cradle of heavy metal and Ozzy's birthplace. The city that once overlooked him now held him tight. They didn't just honor him, they embraced him. They called it the Summer of Sabbath, a months-long celebration that transformed Birmingham into a living shrine. From May to July 2025, the city pulsed with music, murals, and memory. Ozzy wasn't just remembered, he was sanctified. His image flew from lampposts, his voice filled the air, his face stretched across building walls, immortalized in art. But above all, it was one gesture that towered above the rest, the renaming of a central bridge to Osbourne Bridge. It wasn't just concrete and steel anymore. It was a bridge between who he had been and who he had become, between Aston's poor boy and rock's eternal king. Under that sign, fans gathered in droves. They lit candles, they left letters, they cried. Nearby stood a bronze statue, sculpted in vivid, painstaking detail, capturing Ozzy mid-scream, mouth open, hands raised like a prophet, summoning storms. It was no longer just tribute, it was redemption, a reckoning between a city and its misunderstood son. Once Birmingham had judged him as a delinquent, a dropout, a problem. Now it rose to protect him, to honor him, and without knowing, to prepare for his goodbye. Local radio stations played Sabbath classics daily. Schools began teaching music programs built around his songs. City buses flashed, "Thank you, Ozzy," across their LED signs. And then the fans came. They arrived in waves, from the UK, from the US, South America, Europe. Some drove for days. Others flew thousands of miles. They brought vinyls, tattoos, old shirts, leather jackets patched with history. Elderly fans leaned on canes, clutching original Paranoid pressings. Teenagers wore fresh ink, Crazy Train lyrics running down their arms. Families came together in Ozzy shirts, 3 generations shoulder to shoulder. Many were crying before they even reached the gates. Villa Park, now sacred ground, became a place of worship. And yet, despite all the banners, murals, the rising wave of love, no one knew what was really coming. Sharon had told no one. This wasn't just a celebration, it was a goodbye. Those closest to the family felt something had shifted. Ozzy had grown quieter. His smile remained, but it flickered behind the eyes. His movements slowed, his voice softer. Birmingham, in all its joy and tribute, was unknowingly preparing not just for a show, but for a eulogy. The most haunting part, the joy felt innocent. Children danced to songs they barely knew. Couples clung to each other as "Mama, I'm coming home," echoed through cafes. Strangers exchanged Ozzy stories in pubs, buses, sidewalks. There was hope in the air, hope that the Prince of Darkness might roar one more time, and maybe keep roaring. But storms often follow sunsets, and this one was no exception. The summer of Sabbath would soon be remembered not just as a tribute, but as prophecy. A beautiful calm before the storm we didn't want to believe. 17 days later, the grief would arrive. But for now, on that night, the world was about to witness something unforgettable. July 5th, 2025. Under the lights of Villa Park, 40,000 souls stood still. The air was electric. The crowd buzzed. With hope, nerves, love, disbelief. They had watched him battle illness, watched him shrink, tremble, fade. But now, they would watch him come home. And then, he appeared. Not walking, not standing, but seated on a black steel throne. He was rolled onto the stage like a king returning to the battlefield, a monarch of noise and memory. The crowd erupted. It wasn't applause. It was a primal scream. It was thunder, it was tears, and it was love. Ozzy lifted the mic, slowly, and with all the strength he could summon, he sang, "Mama, I'm coming home." His voice, cracked, weathered, still cut through the air like lightning. Each lyric was a farewell. Each breath carried a lifetime. And then, he gave them one last anthem, the one that had started it all. Crazy Train. The opening riff hit, and the stadium exploded. Fans screamed. Ozzy smiled. It was small, tired, but real. A knowing smile, the kind that said, "This is where I belong." There was no speech, no grand send-off, just a nod, tears, and silence so loud it could break your chest. And then, fireworks lit the night. Not as a celebration, but as a salute. A salute to a man who refused to die in silence, who had given everything. even when he had nothing left. Sharon had done what no doctor, no miracle, no money could. She had given him his last truth. One final roar, the stage became his altar, the lights his absolution. And as the sparks rained from the heavens, Ozzy's eyes met Sharon's. They didn't need words. He was home. He was free. On July 22nd, 2025, just 17 days after that unforgettable night at Villa Park, Ozzy Osbourne took his final breath. The man who had electrified generations, who had defied death time, and again, who had turned chaos into legend, was gone. But he didn't slip away in darkness. He left the way he always had, on his own terms, with the roar of applause still echoing in the hearts of millions. At his bedside were the people who knew him not as the Prince of Darkness, but simply as Dad, as a husband, as Ozzy. Sharon sat quietly beside him, her hand never leaving his. Jack, Kelly, and Amy were there too, holding his fingers, whispering love, letting the silence say what words could no longer hold. There were no dramatic speeches, no desperate cries, just soft tears, intertwined hands, and a deep, unspoken knowing that he had finally found peace. He looked at me one last time, Sharon would later recall, her voice breaking, and I knew. I didn't need him to say anything. I saw it in his eyes. He was ready. But the world wasn't. When the news broke that morning, it was like a shockwave had ripped through the planet. From Tokyo to Toronto, millions stopped in their tracks. Stunned. Social media flooded instantly. The hashtag #Thank You Ozzy surged to #1 in more than 60 countries. It wasn't just a trend. It was a global expression of mourning and gratitude. Fans lit candles on their porches. They blasted his records at full volume. They gathered in spontaneous vigils outside the venues he once conquered. For many, it felt like losing a piece of their youth, their rebellion, their identity. Tributes poured in. Sir Elton John posted a black and white photo of him and Ozzy backstage in the 1980s, calling him a force of nature, a dear friend, a rebel poet in leather and eyeliner. The world feels colder today. Rod Stewart called him the loudest soul with the kindest heart. Paul McCartney simply wrote, "Legends don't die, they echo." Ozzy, your echo will never fade. Tony Iommi, his lifelong bandmate, brother-in-arms and closest friend, shared a photo from their final rehearsal together. "I just can't believe it," he wrote. "My dear, dear friend, Ozzy is gone. The laughter, the madness, the music, we shared a lifetime. There will never be another." The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame released a full-length video tribute, tracing Ozzy's journey from the backstreets of Birmingham to the global stage. BBC Radio aired a 10-hour Ozzy marathon, not just his greatest hits, but also rare interviews, unreleased vocals, and emotional messages from fans. ITV interrupted primetime programming to air a segment titled "The World Mourns a Legend." Across the ocean, Times Square lit up with a towering tribute screen, Ozzy's image glowing above the words, "Thank you, Ozzy." In London, candlelit projections of his silhouette appeared on the walls of the Tower Bridge and Symphony Hall. In São Paulo, Brazil, over 1,000 fans gathered to sing "Mama, I'm Coming Home" in Portuguese. In Tokyo, Shibuya Crossing's giant digital billboard played a montage of his most iconic moments. On Sunset Boulevard in Los Angeles, traffic stopped as a spontaneous candlelight vigil swelled past midnight. Even in war-torn cities, fans gathered underground, playing his music through tinny speakers, holding lighters high. He had transcended language, borders, and politics. Ozzy had been a lifeline for the misunderstood, and now they all came back to say goodbye. But perhaps the most haunting tribute came from Sharon herself. In a quiet televised interview 3 days after his passing, she sat beneath a single soft light, holding the wedding ring Ozzy had slid on her finger more than 4 decades earlier. Her words were few, but every syllable trembled with heartbreak and pride. "He didn't just want to live forever," she whispered. "He wanted to matter forever. And he does." Then she paused, held back tears, and added softly, "He gave everything, even when he had nothing left to give."